Welcome back, everyone. Some big updates, actually, in terms of what our government is. Joe Biden has announced new programs. This includes, for example, the renewed negotiations with the World Health Organization to give them governing power over U.S. pandemics, basically giving the World Health Organization unilateral powers to declare health crises and to recommend policies with it. I know there was discussion over whether this could happen in the United States. The Biden administration is writing some of the policies for it. Some of the proposals come directly from the Biden administration, so at least in the short term, yes. These negotiations are underway. You might remember these got thrown out previously. They're back on the table. Also, folks, Biden has he's signed an executive order that I don't know if the full weight of this is fully understood. Basically, this is creating a new federal infrastructure controlled by the White House through all the different branches, not the branches, all the different federal agencies, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Department of State, housing, agriculture, you name it, focused on equity. And equity, you might know, is not equality. Equality is what you and I normally think of in terms of equal opportunity, right? You and I are given essentially the same access. Those who work hard get more, those who work less get less. That's kind of how capitalism traditionally works. Equity means that there's equal outcome, meaning no matter how much work you put in, no matter what you do, the outcome is the same. It's socialism basically, right? That's equal outcome rather than equal opportunity, equity. The White House now has a special office that is going to operate equity programs throughout the entire U.S. government, and Biden just established that. We'll be going into these today. I'll be going into the different parts of this, and folks, it's going to be an interesting episode, so stick around. That said, let's jump into the first story for the day. Those of you on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Facebook, remember we will jump over to Epoch TV after about 25 minutes, so be sure to join us there. And folks, let's start with the first story. Biden is negotiating right now to give the World Health Organization powers to govern U.S. pandemics. This is control, or basically recommendations on policy, but with deeper powers that could even punish different countries if they don't go along with it. This is, if you understand, sorry, my audio too low. I'll get a little closer. I think if you understand what this means, remember right now that the definition of what is a health crisis is no longer what we used to think it was. A health crisis is no longer just a pandemic like a virus. A health crisis is no longer like monkeypox or a disease, which it's that too. A health crisis is now anything that impacts the health of the public. This could be gun violence. This could be poverty. This could be lack of housing. This could be racism. This could be global warming. The definition of a health crisis has expanded to include everything. It could be gun control. In fact, this was even mentioned as one of the health crises in the United States, the gun violence epidemic, which, as we're getting into now, the World Health Organization could have governing powers over. World Health Organization, the same one that could not demonstrate independence from the Chinese Communist Party, which, if you remember, is why Trump pulled us out of it previously, although Biden put us back in. Let me show you what's happening with this right now. This is the Epoch Times. It says, the Biden administration is preparing to sign up the United States to a legally binding accord. Legally binding, meaning it's not just some kind of agreement we can just, acknowledge or listen to. It's legally binding, meaning you cannot choose to not follow it. And that's with the World Health Organization. And that would give this, it says, this Geneva-based, in Switzerland, United Nations subsidiary, the authority to dictate America's policies during a pandemic. It says widespread criticism of the WHO's response to the COVID pandemic. U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra joined with WHO Director General Tedros in September of 2022, you might remember, to announce the U.S. WHO Strategic Dialogue. Remember back in September, we were saying that basically in the fall, we're past that already, there would be new negotiations with the World Health Organization. That dialogue began in September, continued. We're now at the stage where they're going to be signing the agreements, it seems. And it says together they developed a platform to maximize the long-standing U.S. government WHO partnership and to protect and promote the health of all people around the globe, including the American people. It's one world under the WHO. These discussions and others spawned the Zero Draft of a Pandemic Treaty, published on February 1st. That is currently out now, folks, which now seeks ratification by all 194 World Health Organization member states. And so basically, the United States and the World Health Organization work directly with each other, well, the Biden administration work directly with each other to create the proposal, meaning the United States has already not only signed on to it, the United States helped to write it. Now, you might remember last time they tried this, it was thrown out by several African states. It was actually African member states that rejected it. The reasoning for that rejection was what was missed, though. The reason that the African nations rejected it was not because they did not support it. It was not because they did not like it. It was not because they did not like the idea in particular of the World Health Organization managing pandemics in Africa. They threw it out because it did not include everything they wanted. They wanted it to go further. That's which is important to note. It did not get thrown out last time because it was too extreme. It got thrown out last time because it did not go far enough. And we're here now where they have a new proposal co-written or co-produced by the United States and the World Health Organization of the United Nations, which is now going to be voted on. Now it says a meeting of the World Health Organization's intergovernmental negotiating body is scheduled for February 27th. That is this month in just a couple weeks, to work out the final terms, which all members will then sign. Written under the banner of the World Together Equitability, right? Get that? It's not being written. It's not being promoted as protecting the world from the future pandemics. It's being promoted as an equity program, a global equity program. Again, equity meaning equality of outcome. Normally we'd just call that socialism. That is what socialism is, equality of outcome. Right? No matter how much work you do, the outcome, the result is the same. It is, success and failure are mandated by the state. There's a safety net for those who don't pull their weight. Those who pull their weight too much get their benefits taken away and redistributed. That's how it works, right? And it says that the Zero Draft grants the World Health Organization the power, this is the current proposal, will give the World Health Organization the power to declare and to manage a global pandemic emergency. And once a health emergency is declared, all signatories, including the United States, would submit to the authority of the World Health Organization regarding treatments, government regulations such as lockdowns and vaccine mandates, global supply chains, and monitoring and surveillance of populations. You heard that right. This is a quote to the Epoch Times from David Bell, a public health physician and former World Health Organization staffer. He said, quote, "They want to see a centralized vaccine and medication-based response to any global pandemic, and a very restrictive response in terms of controlling populations. They get to decide what is a health emergency, and they are putting in place a surveillance mechanism that will ensure that any potential emergencies to declare. To ensure that there are potential emergencies to declare." If you want to remember, one of the reasons why the argument that was given by different government agencies on why they were not getting rid of the global health emergency. Remember this, the state of emergency we're under still right now for COVID-19. The reasoning they were giving, the argument they were making on why the United States should not drop the emergency declaration was not because the pandemic wasn't over. They declared the pandemic was over. It was because if they were to declare an end to it and relinquish their powers, under the emergency declaration, that what that would do would eliminate a lot of their monitoring capabilities, right? They're monitoring public health. That they have the ability to do a lot of things they could not do legally if we were not under a state of emergency. And so the argument for keeping that in place was not because there was a pandemic, right? They've acknowledged we're in the endemic stage of COVID-19. It was to maintain the monitoring capabilities. At least that was the argument that was made publicly. Now it says this, the WHO Pandemic Treaty is part of a two-track effort coinciding with an initiative by the World Health Assembly, the WHA, to create a new global pandemic regulations that would also supersede the laws of member states. Are you getting that? Supersede the laws of member states. The United States is a member state of this program. If the World Health Assembly were to have the power to supersede American law, I don't know how that would be legal, but this is what they're doing. It says the WHA is the rulemaking body of the WHO, comprised of representatives from the member states. Again, if you get into the nature of what a global health emergency is and the powers that they get from making, a global health kind of crisis declaration, it gives them these additional powers to do things like this. Now, meanwhile, you might remember, again, one of the reasons why the United States was briefly at least pulled out from the World Health Organization was because the World Health Organization was not able to demonstrate its independence from the Chinese Communist Party. Going back to the beginning of this whole crisis, you might remember the Chinese Communist Party was lying to the world. The Chinese Communist Party was lying about, for example, the idea of human-to-human transmission. They actually declared there was no human-to-human transmission with COVID-19. They told the world they had everything under control. They said that their model was working. The CCP model of lockdowns, mask mandates, eventually vaccine mandates, but those came later. But the initial model was mask mandates and lockdowns. And the CCP said it's working. The approach we're using is preventing the spread of COVID-19. There's nothing to worry about. It's not spreading. Don't worry. Everything's fine. The CCP locked down travel within China, opened travel outside of China, and basically ceded the virus to every corner of the world. And while the Chinese Communist Party was doing that, the World Health Organization under Tedros was lying on its behalf. The World Health Organization was restating information directly from the CCP, which misled the world and, in some ways at least, led to a global pandemic. Now, the World Health Organization was questioned over this and also the investigations into a possible origin of COVID-19 because, of course, we were looking into Chinese laboratories. Was it leaked from a lab? What happened? We still actually don't have an answer to that. And the Trump administration took a harder look at the World Health Organization. They produced a whole report on it, and they found the World Health Organization, even when given the opportunity to prove otherwise, could not demonstrate that it was independent from the Chinese Communist Party. It was basically a proxy of the Communist Party of the Chinese regime. Based on the information, Trump pulled the United States out, Biden put us back in, and now we see the World Health Organization playing the same game. This is Nature, the journal Nature. WHO, World Health Organization, abandons plans for crucial second phase of COVID origins investigation. They're not going to be looking into the origin of the virus. And why is that? It's because, well, it came from China. And the CCP is not willing to open its doors, and the WHO is not able to demonstrate its independence from the CCP. The journal Nature says this: the World Health Organization has quietly shelved the second phase of its much anticipated scientific investigation to the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. For briefly, as a use of language note, I know if you're like in the UK or even Canada and you say that something has been shelved, the way it's been explained to me is that in those countries, that means that it's basically been put on the list to be rolled out. They're going to be doing it. In the United States, the meaning of that is actually different. In the United States, if you say something has been shelved, it means that it's basically been temporarily canceled. And what they're saying here is the U.S. interpretation of that the World Health Organization has temporarily, at least, or indefinitely, canceled the investigations into the origin of COVID-19. Now, it says that they're citing ongoing challenges over attempts to conduct crucial studies in China. Yeah, you don't say, right? Nature has learned. It says researchers say they are disappointed that the investigation is not going ahead because understanding how the coronavirus SARS-CoV-2, that's COVID-19 virus, first infected people is important for preventing future outbreaks. Remember, I've mentioned this previously. Under normal circumstances, if you're dealing with a pandemic, one of the very first things, the first questions you would have to answer is, where did it come from? What was the animal reservoir? What is the origin of the virus? Because unless you understand that, you can't put a lid on it. You can't put a cap on it. And even in terms of medical experimentation and development, you need to oftentimes get the source of it in order to experiment on it and understand how to fix it. Think of it as like an anti-venom of a snake. If there's a snake bite, you need to find the snake so you can get the anti-venom. If there's a virus or a pandemic, you need to know where it came from so you can do experiments on how it got out, how it happened, and gain deeper understandings of that, and then begin closing the loopholes that allowed it to spread. They're not doing that, and they're stating they're not even planning to do that. And it appears, at least in my opinion, that politics is what's driving this, not public health. This is a decision that goes against public health, but makes the CCP happy, of course. Now it says, without access to China, which is the problem the WHO is having, you don't say, without access to China, there is little that the WHO can do to advance the study, says Angela Rasmussen, a virologist at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, Canada. And she said their hands are really tied. And that's what's going on right now. You might remember in January of 2021, the World Health Organization did go to China. They went to Wuhan in particular, which is where the suspected outbreak was. Remember the Wuhan Institute of Virology? That was also where the wet market was. Remember the initial narrative was bat soup. That was the rumor, at least. That's where that market was. But again, Wuhan Institute of Virology was the real suspected origin of it. We still don't know, of course. But it turned out that when the WHO had sent people there to go study the origin, they actually did not do any research of their own. They were merely handed information from Chinese Communist Party authorities and basically just worked as the go-betweens for the CCP's propaganda apparatus. Because of that, even though the CCP tried feeding them information saying it did not come from China or a Chinese laboratory, it was never taken seriously. It never made any waves, and even the WHO backed away from it, meaning it never actually went anywhere. In other words, we still don't know, and we're probably not going to know where the virus came from at this point. Now, that being said, folks, I'm going to go into what's happening with these new equity programs being rolled out right now as we speak through the federal government. This is going to change the way that the federal government operates. This is also going to change some of the basic narratives and trainings we have and programs we have coming directly down from the federal government. This is the United States moving away from the basic idea of, equality of opportunity, one of the main bases of freedom, and moving towards equity, equality of outcome, which is regulated access with the intent of creating equal outcomes. Um, Equal opportunity is going away to a large extent in terms of the federal government regulations on these types of things. Um, Again, equity, the managing of people's access or abilities, and making it so that regardless of how much work you put in or how little work you put in, you get the same results. Normally, you would just call this socialism. But the Biden administration has given powers to Susan Rice to create an office under the White House and different branches within all the different branches of the federal government to begin managing these programs throughout all these different agencies. I'll start off with Gateway Pundit, and then we'll go directly into the official documents. Gateway Pundit says Biden gives power to Susan Rice for sweeping racial equity makeover of the federal government. This is a makeover of the federal government. Agency equity teams, so they're calling them, are going to be established to run all departments and re-educate federal workers. It says Joe Biden has appointed Susan Rice to be the chair of the new White House Steering Committee on Equity to conduct a sweeping racial equity progressive makeover of the federal government with the establishment of, quote, agency equity teams. And there's going to be in all departments, and they're going to answer directly to Susan Rice under the White House. Biden issued an executive order on Thursday titled Executive Order on Further Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. It says the agency equity teams will have power and funding to transform the federal government. Get that? Transform the federal government by, quote, delivering equitable outcomes, right? Equality of outcome, not equality of opportunity. Delivering equitable outcomes throughout government policies, programs, and activities. Every year, agencies will submit an equity action plan to the White House Steering Committee on Equity, chaired by Rice. Also, quote, each agency equity team shall support continued equity training and equity leadership development for staff across all levels of the agency's workforce. Ongoing education programs or re-education programs on this new world vision of equity rather than equality. Now, this is a fact sheet on this program, and I kind of went back and forth with myself on how much to include because honestly, just from a significance to what this means, okay, so it's boring. It's a government document. It's boring. But basically, like, you need to know this, folks. This is a fundamental change to our government. This is a fundamental shift in what our government is. This is the introduction now of a new system that is going to have forced equality of outcome. This is the end of equality of opportunity, and this is going to affect tons of branches of government. I mean, really just about all the federal branches of government are going to be doing this, and they're going to be directly controlled through an office of the White House. Now, while these are just little cells basically operating within different branches of government, these little cells operating are going to have power to train all the employees, to hold employees and even programs accountable, meaning that the programs being put out by different government agencies, the government employees themselves, in other words, the operations and the staffing, everything is going to be controlled by this. This is basically affecting everything that is done and everything internal within these organizations. This is a fundamental shift in our government. We have a different federal government under this. And again, the new narrative is equity. Let me show you a fact sheet on this first. I'm going to go over the biggest points. I want to emphasize that this is not complete. It's actually even bigger than this. But if I were to go word for word over the whole thing, you'd all probably fall asleep. So I just want to hit on the biggest points. But it says President Biden signs executive, and this is the White House website, by the way. President Biden signs executive order to strengthen racial equity and support for underserved communities across the federal government. Remember that race is basically racial narratives are used as the bourgeoisie proletariat narrative in the United States. Under Marxism, right, you had the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich and the poor, the upper class and the lower class. Any kind of socialist policy always works in this idea that there's a crisis of inequality that needs to be resolved. And this crisis of inequality is often framed within the bourgeoisie proletariat narrative. It means you have two different classes of people, an upper class and a lower class, and the upper class exploits the lower class just by nature of having control over the means of production. That's classic Marxism. Again, under Lenin, it was the wealthy peasants, the kulaks. Under Stalin, it was just anybody you wanted, class enemies, because he had already established a system. Pol Pot, it was the academics. Hitler, it was the Jews. Mao Zedong, it was the intellectuals and the rightists or the landlords. Every system has its class enemies. In America, what we're not just America, what we're dealing with in modern societies is basically the whole idea the bourgeoisie and proletariat was rewritten by the Frankfurt School. And it was reframed as the idea of critical theory. And critical theory took the bourgeoisie proletariat dynamic narrative and reframed that into a conflict of every single dialectic, every single opposite, every single grouping of individuals, between children and adults, right, like modern education, between men and women, like modern feminism, between critical feminist theory or whatever, between races, which would be critical race theory. And so all the critical theories, critical race theory, for example, are extensions of this rewriting of the bourgeoisie proletariat dynamic. And basically what you're looking at is racial equity being used as the new bourgeoisie proletariat dynamic to give the excuse of programs to manage that dynamic and institute what are just socialist policies in the truest sense of the word. But it states, to strengthen the federal government's ability to address the barriers that underserved communities continue to face today, President Biden signed a new executive order further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities throughout the federal government. I should note briefly, America is not like most countries. America is not like you can have a president come in and just create a communist state. We don't have a system like that. We have divisions of power. You're probably going to see a lot of lawsuits against us, I'll tell you right now. We have divisions of power, 3 branches of government, again, legislative, executive, and judicial. Biden is bypassing that by making an executive order, which actually makes it very shaky legally and makes it easily repealed. It even, aside from Congress going after it, you could have the justice system go after it. The Supreme Court, for example, could challenge this. And you probably will see them do that. But we also have divisions at the state level. There's state governments and so on, which could also push back against this. The only thing this can really affect are government agencies and the services operated beneath them. But this does represent a fundamental shift within the federal government ecosystem, and that's why this could have an effect, although, again, this is not like we're becoming a communist country or something like that. They can't push it that far, in other words, but this is the federal government adopting those types of policies. It says this second order reaffirms the administration's commitment to deliver equity and build an America which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. It's for the people, right? Further, it states it launches a new annual process to strengthen racial equity and support for underserved communities. And I won't go over the whole thing again because it would take all day. But it says among the because it's basically all the federal government agencies are going to have programs under this. I'd have to go through all the programs, but I'll go over some of the main ones. It says this. It empowers federal equity leaders. The executive order strengthens requirements for agencies to build and resource agency equity teams and designates senior leaders accountable for implementing the president's equity mandate. This is also a centralized program. It's centrally controlled through the White House, which eliminates to a large extent the independence of these branches of government from direct control and oversight by the White House. It says the executive order, further in, directs the Office of Management and Budget to support implementation of the annual agency equity action plans through the president's budget request to Congress. The executive order also formalizes the president's goal of increasing the share of federal contracting dollars awarded to small disadvantaged businesses by 50% by 2025, and instructs agencies to expand procurement opportunities for small disadvantaged businesses through grants from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Inflation Reduction Act, and other investments and programs that flow through states and local entities. In my personal opinion, so again, take it piece by piece. Some of these do not sound too bad. Some of them sound terrible in my opinion. Some of them don't sound too bad. If they want to help Black Americans start businesses and create funds for that, good for them. I know. Remember, Trump did some similar stuff too. Remember, Trump created funds to help Black Americans start their own businesses. If they can do that and it doesn't have too many strings attached, that's not a bad thing in my opinion. I don't like the idea personally of my personal opinion. I don't like the federal government being involved on that level because I think it's opening a can of worms. But if you're going to help Black communities build businesses, start businesses, launch them, and then if you don't want to control them like a puppeteer and you cut those strings afterwards, I would say it's not too bad of a thing. We'll see how this plays out. It says also the executive order instructs agencies to focus their civil rights authorities and offices on emerging threats such as algorithmic discrimination in automated technology. This is basically them controlling AI and automation under what is a racial equity program, meaning that it's all going to be centrally controlled now. They're going to improve accessibility for people with disabilities, improve language access services, and consider opportunities to bolster the capacity of their civil rights offices. So it's going to be civil rights offices and so on and whatever else. It further directs agencies to ensure that their own use of artificial intelligence and automated systems also advances equity. In other words, we're not going to have true AI. The different branches of government are working on AI, artificial intelligence, but this is artificial intelligence that has been manipulated in certain ways to ignore the full breadth of human knowledge and the full picture. This is going to be politically biased AI. Think of like, AI is formed by the information it collects. And if you limit the information it collects to a certain worldview or to a certain political party or a certain narrative, it will become weaponized against the opposite, and it will represent only the interests and worldviews of the sphere in which you've placed it. I would say that's not a true AI. Imagine, for example, an academic who, you have different types. You have academics who might study the full breadth of human knowledge, and they tend to have very broad views, and they're not politically biased for the most part. Maybe they have views based on history and so on. Versus an academic who maybe only studied critical theory, like a Marxist academic. The AI being programmed with an equity system is going to be basically like a critical theory academic. And that's going to be the worldview that they're pulling from. I know John Bates, you're saying TGP is already biased and won't even tell jokes. Yeah, look at the interview I did with Zach Voorhees on this. Zach Voorhees was a Google engineer. And again, he was one of the guys who worked on this stuff. Zach Voorhees, a Google engineer and Google whistleblower. I interviewed him just recently. He actually explains how that happens. And basically what it is what I'm talking about. they've limited the ability of AI to access information, and so it can only pull from one set worldview. It's not a true AI. And again, and back to the point I was making about even black businesses and so on. Again, some of the stuff would be good. The problem you often have with receiving federal government money is if it's the same problem you have with public schools, for example. When you accept the money, you also accept a degree of control. You accept the forced adherence to certain protocols and policies that are placed down as conditions for receiving that. And you then have to go by reporting mechanisms, you then have to go by policies, you then have to support certain narratives and certain programs, because you, by proxy and by extension of receiving that money, basically become part of the federal government. You could understand that if those strings are not properly cut, right? If again it's a grant program and there's no strings attached, that could be good. But if it's a program, which is what I believe it is based on the whole narrative of equity, and this is my big concern, if it's a program that maintains those bonds, then that means that basically they're eliminating the nature of private businesses. And once you start subsidizing through government, when you subsidize a business, you basically make that business so others cannot compete against it. This is often the problem you have with socialist businesses and state-run companies and so on. There's the interview I do with Zach Voorhees, folks. If you want to know more about these different chat programs and how they're politically biased, it's a great interview to watch. But back to the point. This was one of the big arguments against not only socialism, but fascism. I would recommend the book Socialism, it's just called Socialism, by Ludwig von Mises. You can also listen to his audiobook, which I often tell you how to listen to, there's a great version on YouTube. It's called Planned Chaos. My concern is this, based on that, is the way that I'll talk about the Nazis, for example. One of the things the Nazis did was just like this. There was a Nazi program where the centralized government would basically create businesses and then assign the workers to run them. They called them shopkeepers. Now, these were not private businesses. It looked like a thriving economy. It looked like businesses were jumping back, but they were not privately owned businesses. They were government-run businesses. And the owners, the people who ran these businesses, were assigned by the state under set conditions, and they were called shopkeepers. You have the same thing throughout any socialist system, just they use different names for it. They use different names for it, and that's it. You could also call this interventionist policy, state interventionism. And the problem you get to oftentimes when you get to that level of state interventionism is that, again, there's strings attached, and even if there are not strings attached, if there's intervention that makes a certain industry basically subsidized, so it does not have to get a profit, it doesn't have to operate in a positive cycle, it can lose money and it's not going to go out of business. What that means is they can charge less money, they can buy cheaper, they can do things that other businesses and competitors cannot do. What that does is eliminates the natural competition in the free market. And by doing so, federal government subsidies basically create behemoths, they create monopolies. And those monopolies then begin to, destroy essentially the free market. You tend to see this within any kind of government subsidy. Government subsidized corn, for example, and the byproducts we have from that, which have many issues. For example, or you can look, for example, at any socialist state where the state-run industries basically dominate, and it's very hard for anybody else to rise up. And a clear example of this is when the Chinese Communist Party went to Australia and began competing in the rail industry. I'll give you a quick example and we move on. CCP went to Australia, began competing in the rail industry. Because they didn't have to make a profit, they could operate in a negative cycle. They could bid below costs, meaning how is a company going to bid below cost? You're not going to make any money. And what's going to happen if you don't make money? You go out of business. You fail. The other businesses in Australia could not compete with the CCP ones because they need to make money to survive, and they can't survive if they can't make money. They lost the contracts. The Chinese Communist Party got the contracts. It expanded, and then it took over the entire industry. A couple of the rail industries went out of business, and the CCP-run industry bought the ones that did not go out of business. It owns them, and by doing so, established a centralized system of control over the rail industry. And then again, if you do that market by market, you conquer essentially the market by manipulating the free market. You can have a capitalist system, on the surface, but in practice, it is not. In practice, you are living under a state-regulated socialist system. It's not capitalism at that point. It's crony capitalism, right? Or even worse, just socialism. But it goes beyond that. Back to this Biden program, it says the Department of Agriculture, another one. This part of this is not so bad, but again, we'll see because, again, we'll see how many strings are attached. It says the Department of Agriculture is administering $3.1 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding. Remember that Inflation Reduction Act, folks? Remember that? The Inflation Reduction Act? Turns out it wasn't about inflation. What they've done now is they created the policy to designate money, and then they created, through executive order, a system to manage the distribution of that money, using and establishing throughout the federal government a system to implement equity, their view of socialism. But it says that basically with this, right, they're administering $3.1 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding to distressed USDA farm loan borrowers and is and assistance for those whose agriculture operations are at financial risks. If they want to bail out the farms and bail out the farmers, I would support that. I would personally hope there's not too many strings attached with that. I'd probably hope there are no strings attached to it. I actually believe that they should be a lot more lenient with farmers in America, because I know a lot of them basically go into debt all the time because they need to take out loans to buy their seeds and stuff and their fertilizers. They are going to be bailing them out. We'll see what's attached to it, but it goes beyond that, because it says the department will also provide $2.2 billion in assistance to farmers who experienced discrimination in USDA's farm lending programs, and includes other stuff based on race and racial, what I would call racial discrimination, whereby they're favoring one race over another. More on this. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is administering $2.8 billion to competitive funding to homeless services organizations throughout the country to wrap up services and housing programs for people experiencing homelessness. I would support things helping homeless people, but then it goes into the second part of this, which goes into combating the long history of discrimination in housing and pushes these fair housing programs based on racial equity and so on as well. Again, it's just, it's just housing projects, and we've seen how those go. It says the Department of Transportation issued, and especially if you get rid of policing as well, right, which they're trying to push for. The Department of Transportation issued proposed rules to modernize a disadvantaged business and enterprise and airport concession disadvantaged business enterprise program regulations, just big names, to help further level the playing field for small disadvantaged businesses, including black and brown owned businesses. Again, it's racial discrimination on the business level, I would say it, mandated ironically by the government itself. I'd question, how black do I have to be? My mom did one of those race programs. I think she was like 0.01% Nigerian. Am I black enough to get this? I think that makes me 0.001%, right? How brown do you have to be? How do you define that? How do you define it? A lot of Latin Americans, for example, right? A lot of Latin Americans, they have Portuguese heritage, they have German heritage, they have Spanish heritage. How brown do you have to be? I'm a quarter Asian. Am I? Is that brown? I don't know. When you get into the realm of designating people by race, when you get into the idea of how do you discriminate based on race, and this would, in the truest sense of the word, this would be discrimination, right? Because remember, discrimination does not necessarily mean hating. Discriminating means you're putting things in different pockets, right? You have white people and black people, and you regard them differently. You are discriminating. You have brown people and black people. You are discriminating them differently. This is the federal government discriminating by race in terms of who gets money and who gets help and who doesn't. Yeah, you're folks saying, yeah, I'm of conservative heritage. I'm actually all American. I'm 100% American. I can trace my family back to the Mayflower, and I personally don't really care that much about these race narratives. Personally, I think growing up, I never cared about that. I didn't even think about my race growing up. I had mixed families, a white family and Asian family. It never made sense to me. I didn't even realize that rice was a cultural thing, right? My Asian family ate rice with every meal. My white family didn't. It never even occurred to me it was a race thing, or a culture thing. I don't care personally. I think the race narratives are divisive. I think they're harmful. I think they are toxic to a society. I think that a nation, there's a difference between being a nation and being a tribal state. A tribal state has pockets. A tribal state divides its pockets and makes its pockets hate each other and oppose each other. A nation is based on the whole premise of uniting and creating a harmony between pockets of different natures. A nation, if you think of the Roman Empire, it was going all the way down into Africa and all the way up into the Germanic tribes. You had Celts, you had Arabs, you had you had blacks, different black countries in some of those areas, all under the Roman Empire. You had many different religions, many different cultures. If you read about the civil wars in Rome, you had all the different cultures rising up against Caesar, for example, races and tribes and everything under one empire. And you need to have some degree of harmony between these different pockets if you're going to have a country. America is based on the same premise. The founding fathers were not of all the same variation of Protestantism. A lot of them did not see eye to eye, and many of them did not like each other's beliefs. Many of them would have been burned as heretics back in Europe, which is one of the reasons why they fled to the United States. And of course, being here with very different beliefs, within different pockets of Protestantism mostly, they managed to form cohesion between their different beliefs, their different views, their different cultures, their different national origins, and even their different states, which at the time were basically seen as unique individual countries with their own laws and everything else. If you're going to create a nation, you need to create harmony between the things that make us different, not create tension between the things that make us different. And that's one of the reasons why I deeply just do not agree with this kind of stuff. Personally, I think people should embrace their heritage, but also embrace what unites us, I'll go deeper into this, folks, but I went a bit long on YouTube. So let's jump over to Epoch TV for the rest of this, and then I want to go deeper into this, because this is a major change in what our government is, at least the federal government. And I will note this is an executive order, meaning the next president can throw it out. It's probably going to have a lot of legal challenges. It's also just the federal government under the White House, meaning Congress is probably going to do a lot against it. You're probably going to see probably even Supreme Court level challenges and even local state legal challenges. And you're going to see local states even try to push back against it, I imagine. This is going to cause a lot of stirring in the country, basically. But again, it does, at least for now, change fundamentally what the federal government represents. Let's jump over for the rest of the show to Epoch TV. First, let me show you a quick trailer. This is Victor Davis Hanson.
I'm just bewildered that these two evil regimes are so asymmetrically treated, as we saw with the balloon. And again, if Russia had done that, we would have shot that down the moment it got near the Aleutians.
Today I sit down with classicist, military historian, and author of The Dying Citizen, Victor Davis Hanson.
Everything is topsy-turvy. The woke obliterates everything. It's destroyed liberalism.
In this broad-ranging interview, we discuss the erosion of Western civilization and the top-down revolution he sees engulfing America.
Then they have the audacity to go back and blame these prior generations for doing what? Defeating the Kaiser or Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo or Brezhnev or Mao. It's really stunning how arrogant, incompetent, and bankrupt this generation is.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick.
Again, folks, that is Victor Davis Hanson on American Thought Leaders. It's a great interview. Be sure to watch it. That's on Epoch TV. Let's jump over exclusively to Epoch TV now. I'll see you there. Folks, thank you for being here. Let's go deeper into this. I know I'm doing a longer segment on this, but I think it's necessary. And I'm not even covering everything